This Torah portion is called Va-yeishev Yaakov, which means that Jacob dwelt, or Jacob lived, or Jacob settled. And it's the beginning of the Chronicles of Joseph, actually, or the story of Joseph, which occupies the rest of the book of Genesis. So Jacob has returned to Canaan. He's buried Isaac, his father. And this narrative begins with Joseph being described as 17 years old, a youth, and he mostly hangs out with the sons of the concubines, Zilpah and Bilhah. It's stated early on that Jacob loved Joseph more than any of the other sons. And since 6 of the 12 sons were Leah's, Joseph was under some duress because of his father's favoritism. Now, Joseph brought back evil reports about the brothers, and nobody knows what those evil reports were, but it just added to the hatred of the other brothers toward him. And to make matters worse, Jacob made Joseph a tunic, a specially designed or colored or fabricated tunic, which also added to the brothers' jealousy because it was an obvious indication, it was a visible sign to everyone of Jacob favoring Joseph. It's interesting to note that because of their hatred, the brothers could not speak with Joseph peacefully. So this in a way is a homiletical lesson or an ethical lesson that if you really hate somebody that much, you should probably avoid talking with them. Now, there are a number of dreams that are coming about in the next few chapters, and the first 2 are Joseph's. The dream entails everyone binding sheaves in the field, and Joseph's sheave stood up in the middle, and the rest of the sheaves bowed down to him, which was an obvious indication to the brothers that he was the sheaf in the middle, and the ones around him that were bowing were his brothers. And the brothers don't need psychoanalytic training to realize the significance of the dream. So Joseph dreams again, and it involves the stars, 11 stars, the sun and the moon bowing down to him. He tells his father Jacob about these dreams, and Jacob scolds him, suggesting he keep those dreams to himself. At the same time, Jacob realized the prophetic significance of the dreams, and he waited for what would occur or what would happen with respect to the dreams being fulfilled. So the brothers are off with the sheep, and Jacob calls Joseph to check up on the brothers. And the brothers are at some distance. So one has to wonder why Jacob basically sent Joseph off to travel some distance to check up on the brothers who made no effort to hide their hatred of him. So Joseph starts off looking for the brothers. He can't find them. A man encounters Joseph on the way. Some suggest that the man was an angel. In any event, Joseph asks the man, where are the 11 or the 10, I guess, because Benjamin is still with Jacob. Where are all those shepherds and their sheep? So the man points him in the right direction. He starts to make his way toward the brothers, but they see him before he sees them, and they plot to do him in. They kind of snicker to each other, well, we'll show him, let's see what happens to his dreams. At first they plan to kill him and throw him in a pit and come back home and tell Jacob that Joseph was attacked and killed by a wild beast. Reuben, the firstborn, decides to step in and suggest they not kill him, but just throw him into a pit, with Reuben's plan to return at some point and pull him out. So when Joseph arrives, they strip him of his beloved tunic. They throw him into the pit, and afterwards they begin to eat a meal, and a caravan of Ishmaelites come by. on their way to Egypt carrying a bunch of merchandise. So Judah then speaks up and suggests that instead of killing Joseph, they sell him to the Ishmaelites and they get rid of him that way. Presumably he'd be sold into slavery in Egypt and he wouldn't be a concern for the brothers anymore. It gets a little confusing here. Who pulled Joseph out of the pit? Was it the Ishmaelites? Was it the brothers? Was it the Midianites, who appear to be somehow related to the caravan of Ishmaelites? In any event, Joseph is pulled out of the pit, which is described as being without any water and empty. And they sell Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, which is imitated or repeated or somehow transmogrified into the story of Jesus and of Judas, who betrays Jesus for 20 pieces of silver. So Joseph is brought down to Egypt. Reuben returns to the pit to find that it's empty, no more Joseph, and he's distraught. In the meantime, the brothers kill a goat, and they dip the tunic into the goat's blood in anticipation of using the blood-stained tunic as evidence of Joseph's death by a wild beast. So they're pretty cruel. When they return to their father Jacob, they show the blood-stained tunic to him, and they ask him to recognize it. Does this belong to your son or not? Rather cruel. Recognize, please, is the expression they open the conversation with. And Jacob is distraught, and he begins a mourning period from which he's really not able to be consoled from. So this part of the narrative ends with the note that Joseph is sold to an official of Pharaoh's court named Potiphar. Now the scenario shifts to Judah. He leaves his brothers and takes up with a Dulamite friend, Hiram, and he appears to marry a Canaanite woman. Depending on the context, the word Canaanite can mean a merchant. And most of the commentators scratch their head about Judah marrying a Canaanite woman, and they instead translate Canaanite as a merchant. But be that as it may, he has a number of sons. The first marries a woman named Tamar. So the first of the sons who marries Tamar does something evil in the eyes of God. What that is not known, but in any event it causes him to be killed by God. The classical interpretation is that he refused to have sex with her. So the next of the sons is called upon to perform what's called levirate marriage, which means if your brother has died and left no children with the widow, as it were, there's the obligation of the next in line brother to marry the widow and to have children in the brother's name. So that brother is called Onan, and he doesn't really feel that confident about the whole situation. At the very least, he's afraid or does not want his children to be considered to belong to his deceased brother. And so he spills his seed on the ground, which is one of the terms for compulsive masturbation, onanism. So this is explicitly evil in the eyes of God, who then kills Onan. So there's one more son, but Judah's catching on that Tamar may be a black widow, and he doesn't want to see the same thing happen to son number 3 as happened to the first 2. So he tells Tamar to go back to her father's house and to be a widow in mourning for a while, and to wait for the youngest to grow up, and then he'd be of marrying age, and Tamar and he could get married at some point. Well, the years pass and the youngest son grows up, and Tamar sees that Judah has not given him to her for a husband. So Tamar arranges to meet up with Judah in disguise. She disguises herself as a harlot, as a prostitute, at the crossroads. She's covered with a veil. Judah, the wife of Judah, has passed away. He went through a mourning period and is on his way to shear his sheep. And Tamar hears about it and pulls this ruse on Judah. So Tamar is by the crossroads. Judah sees her and he turns to her to have sex with her. And she says, "What will you give me?" And he responds, "A kid, a goat kid." And she says, "Okay, but what's your collateral? What's your surety? What's your pledge?" And he gives her three things: a ring and a sash and a staff. So they have sex. She gets pregnant. In the meantime, Judah returns and asks his friend to bring the kid to the harlot. But, nobody knows who the harlot is. In the meantime, Tamar has put on her widow's garb and is living with her father again. So this is kind of embarrassing for both Judah and the Adullamite because they can't find the so-called prostitute with whom Judah slept. After about 3 months, Tamar begins to show from her pregnancy, and word gets back to Judah that Tamar has gotten pregnant from being a harlot. Unbeknownst to everyone, the father is Judah. So Judah commands for her to be killed, burned at the stake, I guess. And she says, or she sends those three things to Judah, the staff and the ring and the sash, and kind of pulls a fast one on him, saying, "Recognize, please, the person to whom these belong is the father of my child." So Judah catches on, admits his role, responsibility in all of this, and Tamar is saved at the last minute. So Tamar has twins, which is similar to Rebekah having twins, Jacob and Esau. Tamar has twins as well. And one of them actually turns out to be a progenitor of Ruth, who's the progenitor of David, a few generations down. So Tamar, who most likely is a Canaanite, is ultimately one of the matriarchs of David, who will be the seed from which the Messiah springs. So the story returns to Joseph, who's in Egypt with Potiphar. And so God gives Joseph all kinds of success in Potiphar's house. And as a result, Joseph is made the steward of the house. So there's a note about how handsome Joseph is, and the next paragraph goes into describing how Potiphar's wife has got schemes on him, has got designs on him. So she tries repeatedly to seduce him, and he just says no. And then one day he comes to the house and there's nobody there but the wife because everybody's getting ready for some kind of festival. She grabs at Joseph and he flees, but he leaves his garment in her hand because she's grabbing at his clothes, and he runs outside. So this looks pretty bad for her, and she screams and makes a big story up about how Joseph was trying to rape her and she got away and in the nick of time, and he left his coat there, and bad Joseph. Later in the day, Potiphar comes home, and the wife describes this made-up scenario. And one would think if it were true, or if Potiphar believed his wife, he would have summarily executed Joseph, but instead he puts him in the royal jail. So it's clear that Potiphar is not convinced of the legitimacy of his wife's story. Still, though, it's a real step downward for Joseph. But God is with Joseph again, and everything that he does in the prison is quite successful. And in the same way as occurred with his role in Potiphar's house, the jail warden puts everything under Joseph's command. Now some time passes, and two of Pharaoh's courtiers end up in the same prison. One is the head baker, and the other is the head cupbearer. And they both dream. They each dream their own dream, but the dreams are similar in as much as they portend their future. They're disturbing dreams, though, and there's no one to interpret them. Joseph comes in to work in the morning, and the two chamberlains or the two courtiers look upset. He asks what's the matter, and they describe their dreams. The dream of the cupbearer is a more upbeat one, there are some vines, some grapes. He squeezes the grapes into the cup of Pharaoh and puts the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So Joseph interprets that as, in 3 days you'll be released and you'll be returned to your post. The chief baker is enthusiastic and excited about the positive interpretation of the dream of the cupbearer by Joseph, and volunteers his dream, which is of some baskets with baked goods that are on top of his head, and some birds are eating from the top basket. And so the interpretation of that dream isn't anywhere nearly as propitious. And Joseph interprets it to mean, in 3 days you'll be released, but you'll be hung from a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh. So, as it turns out, both of those things took place. The cupbearer was returned to his post, and the chief baker was executed. When Joseph finishes his positive interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, he asks the cupbearer to remember him to Pharaoh. And he explains that he was stolen from the land of Canaan, and that's the reason he's in Egypt in the first place, and he never did anything wrong in Potiphar's house. So the cupbearer is returned to his post, but does not tell Pharaoh about Joseph, and some years go by. So that's the end of this Torah portion. It has to do with dreams, and there are dreams in the next Torah portion as well, this time the dreams of the Pharaoh. And these end up getting Joseph released from prison and the beginning of his reign as a vice Pharaoh. So people are wondering, what does any of this have to do with the psychedelic drug experience? Well, it has to do with interpretation of visions. There's a rabbinic saying that the dream follows the interpretation. So I think it's the same way with psychedelic vision. The vision follows the interpretation. So if you understand what you see in your visions, if you've got the vocabulary and the skill to decode the enigmatic or inexplicable content of a vision, you'll be able to interpret in a mature, sophisticated manner, as opposed to just being amazed by it, confused by it, befuddled in awe. If you can extract meaningful information which would then impact your daily life, then you're that much further ahead.